I invite you to become the one who forgives all. I invite you to leave the wounded child behind. I invite you to leave the angry man, the angry woman behind. I invite you to leave the storyline. I invite you to become the Savior of the world. I invite you to become the great father, the great mother, the one whose perspective is from a very high point above all of this suffering that seems to be going on. I invite you to a place where you may look upon your fellow human being and see simply that they are suffering. And then I invite you to see through that suffering, like a parent sees through the suffering of a small child, without judgment, without anger. I invite you to this higher vantage point, this place where we look down upon everything, yet judge nothing. We see the state of reality as it seems to be now, yet we are not bound to our own judgments. I invite you into a state of being which is love. We spend so much time, some of us, trying so hard to forgive. Forgiveness is really effortless. Forgiveness is effortless. Forgiveness is a state of being. Forgiveness is a state of becoming the one who forgives. You see, the wounded child cannot forgive. The angry adult cannot forgive. The victim cannot forgive. There is one who forgives, and that one is you, but is not you at the same time. There are these shallower aspects of our being. Sometimes we call them ego. We call it the false self. We may call it the flesh or the body. These discursive thoughts that we have, these disturbed emotions, these wounded parts of our being, they can never forgive. But there is a being that is deeper down in your core. You might imagine it like a sphere, almost like a planet. And at the very inner core, the infinite inner core, somehow infinitely deep, is the true being, is the one being. That which is in us that is inviolate, that which cannot be harmed, that which cannot be wounded, that place in us where suffering and death and lack and loss cannot exist. That eternal, that unchanging being at our very center, absolutely still, absolutely unchanging, absolutely and unconditionally unforgiving and accepting of everything. Now, if you imagine yourself leaving that place of safety, that home, and going further out toward the external parts of our sphere, closer to the surface, this is where our ego resides. These are the shallow parts of our nature, as we might say. These are the more out there parts of our nature. Oh, he's so shallow. Oh, he's really out there, right? And there's a whole world of surface area. And there are these little cities and nations, and they are ego-driven. And these are all within ourselves. And sometimes our ego can go to war against another part of our ego. There are places in our ego that are very good and very humble acting and very loving acting, and they try to fix those other parts of our ego on the surface that seem to be so bad. And there's all this fixing, and there's all this warring, and there's all this struggle, and this is where our divided mind comes from, yes? Because we have a divided mind on our external. We think this, we wonder that. Oh, what about this? Maybe it's, oh no, and it seems that we're at war with ourselves. And this is where all war comes from, is the war that begins with our divided mind, with our ego mind. And this is what Einstein meant when he said that there is no problem that can be solved in the same state of consciousness that it was created from. We cannot solve all these external problems from this state of consciousness that is so shallow, that is out there, right? This is where the alcoholic is. This is where the addict is. This is where the victim is. Those wounded parts of our being that are so desperately hoping for healing because they know they're hurting so much, that are so desperately trying to forgive. But these states of consciousness are incapable of forgiveness, and they are incapable of actually solving any problems. The invitation today is to go back to that deeper space, that infinite core of love, wisdom, generosity, nurturing, and care. The invitation is to come back home. And this is what all the wisdom practices are inviting us to do. This is what all the practices are inviting us to do, is to come back home. And this is where the Christ mind is, or the mind of the Buddha, the source, the one, the great spirit, that which is unobjectifiable, the great mystery that has been pointed to throughout the ages, that which all the mystics have experienced, this depth, this perfect love. This is the invitation that's being made to you right now, is to sink deep into this one mind, this true mind, this one who forgives. Now, I realize that in one of my descriptions, we were high up above all the confusion. And in the last description, we were deep, deep down in the core. It is through this sinking deep, deep down into the infinite core of being that we somehow mysteriously find ourselves on high. Yes. Do you see the poetry in that? The beauty in that? That the higher we try to go, the more confused we actually become. But when we surrender and sink like that stone to the bottom of the stream, when we surrender, when we make a decision to turn our lives and our will over to the care of something greater than our shallow selves, then a miracle happens. All of a sudden, we are that one who forgives. Forgiveness is effortless now, and nothing that anyone can say or do has any power over us anymore. We thought we were victims of the world that we see. And then we thought that if we struggled and fought hard enough, that we could overcome and destroy all those other parts that seemed to be victimizing us. But the more we struggled, the more we found resistance on the outside and on the inside. Can you see this with me today? Allow yourself to become the one who forgives, the one who holds no resentments, the one who has no worries, the one who has no fears or doubts. The wounded inner child is now forgiven. There is a micro-ego, the ego of the individual. And then there is the macro-ego, each part being a universe in itself. So as we look out on the world, we may understand all that we have created here as part of our individual ego constructions. Yes? Can you see that? That our individual egos created the macro ego, created the systems and the institutions that we understand to be so lacking and so unhelpful. And then that macro ego seems to create and influence all of the individual egos to the point where we look out on everything that we see and it seems to be a parody. We see these caricatures of ourselves showing up on the outside, and we look at them and we have a choice when we see those caricatures showing up. Those political caricatures, those ones who seem to be in power, those ones that seem to be who we hate. But in this model, they're really just the projections of our own insanity. So we begin to look on those external manifestations of ego, and we begin to see ourselves in them. We begin to see our own suffering. But this can only be done as we surrender, as we sink into this deeper state of forgiving consciousness, where somehow, mysteriously, we find ourselves elevated, seeing the big picture from a greater vantage point where there is no judgment. This is the invitation today. The invitation to release your suffering. Who is the one who suffers? The one who suffers is the shallow one, the wounded one, the victim, that one who believes that life is happening to him. Why is this happening to me? That one will never be healed. That one will fight and kick and cling. That one can be forgiven. As we release ourselves, as we allow ourselves to become the greater consciousness, as we allow ourselves to experience that Savior which is in each of us. As we sink and surrender into those deeper realms, things become quiet. The arguing ceases. The fighting stops within ourselves. And we become a source of healing to the world instead of a source of dissonance. And in our own being, we begin to observe the insanity taking place, yet we are not identified with it anymore. And in this way, we begin to forgive ourselves. Sometimes we think we're deep when we're really acting pretty shallow. Anytime we elevate ourselves above someone else, anytime we put ourselves below someone else, we're acting from our shallow nature. That is not you. This is an invitation to become the true self. This is an invitation to allow those hurting parts of you to rest, to disidentify from those hurting parts of you, to become the one, to become the Christ, become the Savior. All that suffering is left behind. This is the invitation that the sages have been making throughout the centuries. This is what all the religious practices are pointing to. It's rather simple, but when we're caught in the stories of suffering, it seems impossible. There is no demand made. There is no punishment. There is no finger pointing. That's all stuff of the shallow nature. That's not the stuff of God. We have a mind which can choose. between the suffering and the love. We have a will that can choose. And the practice begins like this. Every time a face of anger comes to us, every time a sense of dissonance comes in our being, we choose love. We choose not to accuse. We choose to forgive that which we think we see on the outside. We forgive that on our inside. We acknowledge that everything that we see is actually just a subjective experience that's happening right in here, and that we create that experience, that we get to choose how we see that experience, and we get to release, let go, surrender, become that one who forgives. Don't spend a lot of time trying to forgive these manifestations with your ego. Go straight to the source. Know that to forgive, we must sink deep down into consciousness. This is what the mindful meditations have been all about. They've been training us to follow the breath, thereby leaving our story behind. You may follow your breath right now. You may leave the story behind. You may allow yourself to experience the deeper consciousness. Allow yourself to become that one. Sink down into the infinite depths of love, and you will eventually find yourself seeing everything from on high, forgiving everything and everyone, not taking any of it too seriously, with a big yawn, just waking up from the nightmare that you thought you were in. You are not that nightmare. You wake up from the dream, realizing that we are still in another dream, and there is no fear. There is no fear here. Because we are embodying our true nature, which is perfect, which is whole, without blemish. This is the theosis, the becoming one with God, knowing that it is the most humble of all things to understand ourselves as God, to understand ourselves as the one, to understand ourselves as the Savior, as the Christ. This is why Jesus said, I and the Father are one. He saw through the illusion. He allowed the false self to pass away. And in that, there was a resurrection, a deeper self. And this is our promise, that we too can experience that deeper self. The seed that goes into the ground, dies. And in that death, roots go down into the soil, drawing nutrients. Leaves shoot up through the soil, reaching toward the light, both wave and particle, which is now turned into nutrients for us. The light is forgiveness. Forgiveness is strength, and strength is happiness. We know that happiness cannot be attained through acquiring possessions, through acquiring power. We see that. We see that in ourselves, and we see that in the rich and famous who seem to be out there. We know that true happiness can only be attained by becoming this one, by allowing ourselves to become this peaceful nature. We become the one who forgives. And this is the invitation. Come home. Come home. Come home.